So all this time, while slavery is being resisted and is growing, and land speculators are selling up tracts of land and people are settling in the West, the Indians are still dealing with the impact of westward expansion. So most Indian tribes tried to keep their distance away from white Americans and moved westwards. We know that that caused some conflict between Indian tribes themselves. By 1820, though, there were 5 Indian tribes that decided to try and live alongside white Americans, and these were known as the civilized tribes. They followed Christianity, they wore what would be deemed as white clothes, and even had their own books, schools, and newspapers. And as cotton was growing more and more important in the south in particular, but as well in the north, plantation owners asked the US government to move the Indians off more land in order for slavery to expand further. So in 1830, a law was created known as the Indian Removal Act, which then forced more Indians off their own land in order for white Americans to use it. None of the tribes were obviously happy with having to move. They were told to move into Oklahoma in return for a small amount of money. As we know, the Indians were shifted constantly westwards despite this offer. The Creek and the Seminole Indians, they actually fought back during this move, and the Cherokees were also forced to move west as well. And in 1838, almost all the land in the south was open for white settlers now. We're going to look at more detail on how the Indians experienced westward expansion. So some tribes, as I said, they tried to assimilate, so they tried to become civilized in the eyes of the white Americans. So Cherokees, the Creeks, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, and the Seminoles, and they hoped it would help to save their territory. The Cherokees, they went the furthest. They modelled their economy and government on the US structure. They built a capital in their territory and created an alphabet so they could have their own language. Soon more Cherokee than white people could actually read, and they also created their own newspapers. Unfortunately, the Indian Removal Act still happened in 1830, and it was signed by President Andrew Jackson. Remember, he is a Southerner and a supporter of slavery, so that kind of explains why he signed it. And this set aside a tiny part of the current state of Oklahoma to the Indians, paving the way for these reservations that happened later in our course. They were supposed to be voluntary move, but it most definitely wasn't. Whenever a white settler had a dispute with an Indian tribe, Indians were just going to be removed, and that just consistently happened. Most groups were actually pressured into moving, and it led to an event known as the Trail of Tears. So a really, really long journey for the Cherokee tribe in particular to their new home, in which lots of Cherokee natives actually died due to the long journey and harsh conditions. So there's lots of examples of Indian resistance. We're just going to talk about a few. So the Cherokee actually took the US to court over the Indian Removal Act, and they actually won their court appeal, but it was deemed that because they weren't US citizens, the US had to act in their best interest instead. So the Cherokee later signed a treaty with the US government, and they and a small group headed to the new Indian Territory. But almost the whole population said that this treaty was a fraud and wasn't representative of the whole of the Cherokee tribe. In spring 1838, 7,000 army troops arrived and forced 18,000 Cherokee onto concentration camps, and also forced them in the winter across to their new territory in a 3-month-long march, where 4,000 to 5,000 died. That was the Trail of Tears that I've just discussed. The Seminoles, they also resisted. Some signed a treaty and went to the new Indian Territory, but others refused and fought in the Second Seminole War. This cost the government lots and lots of money. Some escaped slaves also fought on the side of the Seminoles too. Eventually, the government had to admit and offered a safe passage for their chief to get to the new territory, but he was captured and then killed. And after this, the Seminole moved westwards, and there was the Third Seminole War. By the end of this, only 200 of this full tribe remained, and they actually had to be paid to move west, as was set out in the Indian Removal Act. The Creek, they also resisted too. They signed a treaty and were promised land in return, but they didn't get it. By 1835, the Creeks had begun stealing livestock of white settlers to get their revenge, who they believed were illegally on their land, and they also killed some of the white settlers too. The Alabama government calls the US government Secretary of War in to remove all the remaining Creeks, and by 1837, 15,000 Creeks had now been moved westwards. So a suggested activity for this section is to complete this spider diagram. So looking at which groups assimilated, what the Indian Removal Act was, and some Indian resistance. Well done! So you have now completed the first full section of the America topic. This is another suggested activity for you to do, so you could make a timeline. You don't need the exact dates, but a timeline of all the events that we've discussed alongside one another, and then colour code them for our three groups of people and their experience of early American expansion. I hope you've enjoyed this video and you've found it really useful. Remember, there are following videos for this as well. Don't feel like you need to watch them all at once. Take your time, pick a few that are most relevant to you and your gaps in your knowledge. And yeah, I'll see you soon.